Welcome to Module C16, File Handling. In this module, we move outside the database and start working directly with files, both on the SAP application server and on the user's own PC. By the end of this module, you'll be able to read and write files on both server types, choose the right encoding, and know when to use which approach for a task like Acme Manufacturing's vendor file exchanges. 3 things to walk away with. First, reading and writing files on the SAP application server itself. This is the automated, no human-involved route, using Open Dataset, Transfer, Read Dataset, and Close Dataset. Second, moving files to and from a user's own PC using CL_G_frontend_services. This is what you use when a business user needs to upload a spreadsheet or download a report. Third, and most important for real project work, knowing which approach Acme Manufacturing should use for a given scenario and handling the errors that come with either. Before we get into syntax, let's talk about why this matters. Even in a world of APIs and iDocs, plain files are everywhere in SAP landscapes, bank statement imports, vendor master loads, legacy system interfaces, one-off data corrections a business user does with a spreadsheet. Acme Manufacturing, for example, receives a daily vendor payment file from their bank, and finance teams frequently need to upload corrected purchase order data from Excel. ABAP gives you 2 distinct toolkits for this. One for the SAP server's own file system, and one for the user's local PC. Getting them confused is one of the most common fresher mistakes, so we'll be very deliberate about which is which. This is the single most important distinction in this module. The application server file system belongs to the SAP server itself. It's the Linux or Windows box the instance runs on. You reach it with Open Dataset, Transfer, Read Dataset, and Close Dataset, and critically, this works with no human present, which is why it's what you use in background jobs. The presentation server is the opposite. It's the file system of whoever is sitting at their PC running SAP GUI right now. You reach that with CL_GUI_frontend_services, and it only works in an active foreground GUI session. You cannot call GUI_upload from a background job, because there's no PC to upload from. Acme's nightly bank file import runs on the application server. Acme's finance analyst manually uploading a spreadsheet correction uses the presentation server. Keep that mental model, which server, which person, and the rest of this module falls into place. Every application server file operation is bracketed by Open Dataset and Close Dataset. Open Dataset takes a mode for output to write and overwrite, for input to read, or for appending to write while keeping what's already there. You also choose text mode or binary mode. Text mode is what you'll use for CSV and other flat files, and you should always specify an encoding default or encoding UTF-8, rather than leaving it to chance, because that's a very common source of garbled characters in cross-system files. Binary mode is for anything that isn't text: images, PDFs, zipped archives. After Open Dataset, always check SY_subarc. A non-zero value means the file could not be opened, perhaps because the path doesn't exist or the work process doesn't have permission, and the message addition gives you a human-readable reason you can log. And just like opening a database cursor, always Close Dataset when you're done, even on the error path, or you can exhaust the server's open file handles. Transfer is the statement that actually writes a record to an already open dataset. It writes exactly 1 record per call, so the usual pattern is loop over your internal table, build a delimited string for each row using string templates, and transfer that string to the file. In this Acme example, we're building a semicolon delimited line from the vendor payment structure and writing it inside the loop. Note we open the file once, outside the loop, and only close it once we're completely done. Opening and closing inside a loop is a classic performance mistake because every Open Dataset is an operating system call. Also note the encoding UTF-8 here, since Acme's downstream bank system expects UTF-8 encoded files. Reading is the mirror image of writing. Open for input, then loop, typically with do/enddO rather than a fixed count, since you don't know in advance how many lines the file has, calling read dataset into a string variable each time. The end-of-file signal is exactly the same pattern you've seen with internal table reads. SY_subarc becomes non-zero when there's nothing left to read, and that's your cue to exit the loop. Once you have each line as a string, Split at is the usual way to break a delimited record into its fields. Here we're splitting Acme's semicolon delimited vendor line back into vendor number, name and amount, and building an internal table row from it. Same rule as before. Close the dataset once, after the loop, not inside it. Now let's cross to the presentation server side. CL_GUI_frontend_services is a class that talks to SAP GUI's control framework running on the user's PC. That's why it needs an active foreground GUI session and won't work in a background job. The two workhorse methods are GUI_upload, which reads a file the user selects on their own machine into an internal table, and GUI_download, which writes an internal table out to a file on their PC. Both take a file name, a file type, ASC for text delimited data, bin for binary, and either a changing or exporting data_tab parameter. Both raise exceptions like file_open_error or file_write_error. And exactly like our dataset examples, you must check sy_subrc afterwards rather than assuming success. In an Acme scenario, GUI_upload is what powers the finance team's manual PO correction upload, and GUI_download is what lets a purchasing manager export a report to Excel. In practice, you rarely hardcode a PC file path, file_open_dialog, another CL_GUI_frontend_services method, pops up the native Windows file picker so the user chooses their own file, filtered to the extensions you specify, here just CSV files. It fills a file_table with the chosen path, which you then read out and feed into GUI_upload. This matters for two reasons. It's simply better UX than typing a path, and it avoids brittle programs that only work on one specific user's machine with one specific folder layout. The same pattern applies in reverse with file_dialog when you want the user to choose where a download should be saved. Three things separate a training exercise from production-ready file handling. First, every single dataset or GUI file statement can fail. A directory that doesn't exist, a file another process has locked, a full disk, so sy_subrc must be checked after every one, not just the open. Second, encoding. If you don't explicitly state encoding UTF-8 or encoding default, you're relying on system defaults that can differ between servers, and that's exactly how accented vendor names or currency symbols turn into garbage characters in production. Third, and often missed by freshers, application server file access is governed by the authorization object s_dataset, which restricts which program can open which physical path in which mode. If you build a file path dynamically, say, from a selection screen parameter, always run an authority check against s_dataset before the open dataset, exactly the same discipline we covered for business authorization objects back in module C13. Here's the scenario you'll build in today's lab. Acme Manufacturing needs to export its open vendor payments as a file their bank can consume. You'll pull the payment data from the database into an internal table, write it out to the application server as a semicolon delimited CSV using UTF-8 encoding, and then, to prove it actually worked, read the same file back with read dataset and compare it against what you wrote. As a bonus stretch goal, you'll add a GUI_download path so a finance user could also pull the same data straight to their PC. This exercise deliberately touches every statement from this module: open dataset, transfer, read dataset, close dataset, and optionally CL_GUI_frontend_services. 3 takeaways to close on. 1. File handling comes in 2 completely separate toolkits depending on which file system you're touching: application server statements versus CL_GUI_frontend_services. And picking the right one for the scenario is the real skill, not memorizing syntax. 2. Treat every file call as fallible, check sy_subrc every time, and always state your encoding explicitly rather than trusting a default. 3. Dynamically built application server paths need an s_dataset authorization check, the same discipline you already learned for business authorization objects in module C13. Next module, C17, we move on to sending that file as an email attachment using the business communication service. See you there.